Hi, my name is Gary Hinolan. I'm the Partner Technology Advisor for Microsoft Philippines. What I do is I train partners how to sell all the Microsoft product from Windows Client to Windows Server to server application to cloud services. I also do deep dive licensing training and technical training to customers and partners. And today we will discuss the SQL Server 2014 licensing. So our contents first is we will discuss the recap of changes of the licensing. SQL Server 2012 and SQL Server 2014 almost has the same licensing, but with minor changes. Next, we will do a SQL 2014 deep dive licensing for per core and virtualization and license mobility. Next, we will talk about the timelines and migration path of SQL. SQL 2014 edition is almost the same as SQL 2012. We have standard edition, we have the business intelligence edition, and enterprise edition for mission critical, OLTP, and data warehousing and business intelligence. Standard edition is for basic database MBI. Business intelligence is for rapid data discovery with Power View. And you have managed self-service analytics, single BI semantic model, and inclusive of standard edition. Enterprise edition, we have this new feature called in-memory performances across OLTP, data warehousing, and BI. We have always on high availability on premises and cloud, which is Microsoft Azure. Mission critical security, mission critical scalability, enterprise data warehouse, and inclusive of business intelligence edition, all the features of business intelligence. Licensing model, standard edition, it's licensed for server and call or per core. Business intelligence is licensed for server and call only, and enterprise edition is licensed per core only. Now, we will talk about a quick review of the licensing changes. SQL licensing modification, SQL 2014, all editions, the SQL failover servers rights become an SA benefit. You need to have a software assurance to do a failover. For SQL 2013 Business Intelligence editions, it's relaxed rules in multiplexing. We will discuss later on what multiplexing is. And all editions, no other pricing and licensing changes to SQL. So failover, what is failover? So here's the differences between SQL 2012 failover versus 2014. Before, with SQL Server 2012 failover, you have an active passive. And with 2012 SQL, the license is reassigned to passive during a failover event and must follow 90 days reassignment rule without a software assurance. It means before, with 2012, if you don't have a software assurance, you can reassign the license within 90 days only. Okay? Today, with SQL 2014, you need to have a software assurance. Okay, that's new in 2014. But the 90 days reassignment rule is waived due to the license mobility of software assurance benefit. Again, you need to have a software assurance to do failover. Plus, you don't need to follow the 90 days rule. So that's the differences between the 2012 SQL and 2014 SQL. So when you say license mobility, the active passive, so a passive SQL Server instance is one that is not serving SQL Server data to client or running active SQL Server workloads. So in this example, we have a server 1 with 12 cores and it's active. It requires a software assurance. And the passive server as you can see, no additional license required. So if it's if it's serving data such as reports to clients running SQL Server workloads, or perform any tasks or work such as being made from a secondary servers, then it must be licensed for SQL Server. And primary server licenses support for one secondary only. So this is the same scenario earlier. And if you have additional secondary server, the secondary server must license for SQL Server. And they must have the same specification or the number of cores. In this example, the active has 12 cores and the passive has 12 cores. Okay. Now, the BI server, business intelligence server access for multiplexing. So multiplexing is when customers use hardware or software to pull connections, reroute information, or reduce the number of devices or users that directly access or use a product. So it's somehow like bridging. It means, like, for example, a customer doesn't connect to the SQL database directly. The customer connects to the application, then application or the device connects to the database. So that's like multiplexing. And multiplexing can also include reducing a number of devices or users a product directly manages. So here's a typical scenario of an SQL Server call licensing. Okay, and how does it work? So this is how it works. So you have you have a physical server, and if you have an SQL, you must have a Windows server. Now, any users or any device who inputs, query, or view data automatic, you need to have an SQL Server license. I mean, an SQL Server client access license plus a Windows Server license, since you're connecting to the Windows Server. Now, this is where multiplexing comes in. You have a device or an application. It's basically pulling the data from the SQL, and this device and application needs to have a client access license of SQL. And this application and device will pass the data to the user, or the user would input, query, or view data on this application, and then this application will pass it on to the SQL database. In this case, the user or the device need to have an SQL Server call and a Windows Server. So that's how multiplexing works, and these are the licensing for the multiplexing. Because some users would say, like for example, in this one, if I go back, the user would tell us, like, I'm the user, I'm not connecting directly to the SQL Server. I'm connecting to the application, and the application is connecting to the database. So it's like bridging again. So in that case, the user needs to have a client access license. So let's discuss and show you some scenarios about multiplexing. Scenario 1. We have a number of users, and these users will connect to an application, and the application will connect to the SQL Server. Is this multiplexing? Yeah, the answer is yes, because the application is pulling data from the SQL database. Scenario 3. Number of users will connect to an application, and then application will connect to an SQL Express, and SQL Express is free. Then from SQL Express goes to an application system, and then application system going to the SQL Server. As you can see, the users are not connecting directly to the SQL Server. It passes through almost three applications, right? In this case, it's still multiplexing, and the users needs to have an SQL call. Last scenario, customer users will connect an application, and there's a freeware, and then freeware to application to the SQL. Same thing. You need to have a client access license. So for BI server access and multiplexing, the changes before, with SQL Server BI 2012, the multiplexer requires a client access license. So calls are required for all data sources that fed data into the BI server, regardless of batch processing or real time. Now here's the new licensing for SQL Server 2014 BI edition. As you can see, the multiplexer does not require a client access license as long as it's a batch process. Batch is defined as an activity where tasks that occur at different times are processed at the same time. Okay, so calls are not required for data resources that batch process data into a BI server. If it's a non-batch process, then it requires a client access license. So these are the changes of minor changes of SQL Server licensing from 2012 versus 2014. Now let's talk about the deep dive licensing for SQL. So for SQL Server 2014 licensing, we will talk about the server and call licensing. Server and call licensing means you're going to install the SQL Server 2014 in a physical server or in a virtual machine. Okay, that's why it's called for physical and virtual licensing. Okay, server and call is for physical installation or installing the license in a virtual machine. Per core model is for physical licensing only. Now, this is per core. You basically count the number of cores on a processor. Okay. Virtual core licensing, if you're going to install the SQL Server inside a virtual machine, and we're licensing it per core. And we will discuss the license mobility. So again, we will recap the licensing for SQL Server 2014. So Enterprise is per core only. Sometimes I got a lot of questions from partners and customers. They would still keep asking me if they can buy Enterprise Edition for server and call. The answer is no. Enterprise Edition is per core only. Business Intelligence is for server and call only. So if it's a server and call, you need to buy a client access license per user or per device. So any users or any device connecting to the SQL, you need to buy client access license. And as you can see, if it's per core, okay, remember the Enterprise Edition is for core only, you don't need to buy client access licenses. It means it's unlimited users. Any users can connect to the SQL Enterprise Edition since it's per core licensing. If it's per core, it's unlimited users. You don't need to buy calls. If it's a server and call licensing, each users and each device needs to have a client access license. Next one, Standard Edition. Standard Edition, you can license or buy Standard Edition through server and call. If it's a server and call, then each users or each device is connecting to the SQL needs to have a client access license. Or you can buy SQL Standard through per core licensing. If it's per core, you don't need to buy client access license. It's unlimited users. So that's the overview of SQL Server 2014 licensing. Data Center, Workgroup, and Small Business Editions are all retired, so they're no longer available. Web Edition is available to third-party software providers only, and Developer Edition is still available with the server and call licensing model. So, first is server and call licensing. So for client access licenses for SQL, you have device call or user call. Licensing for server and call is 1:1. It means if you have one physical server, it doesn't matter how many physical processor or how many cores is just one license. And one license for clients. So that's how it works. One license for physical server, we don't count the number of cores. One license per virtual machine, we don't even count the number of cores. Again, for server and cal, you can install the license on a physical server or on a virtual machine, and we don't count the number of cores, it's just one. And then one client licenses per client, if it's a user cal or a device cal. So let's do an example. You have a physical server with 4 processors and 6 cores each. Again, we don't count the number of processors, we don't count the number of cores. Since it's just one physical server, then that's one license. Then we count the number of users. In this case, you have 3 users, then you need to buy 3 client access licenses. So again, 1:1. Now, what if we create a virtual machine and install the license inside a virtual machine? So in this second example, we have one physical server, and we've installed the SQL license in the physical server. Then we've created 2 virtual machines, and we assign 2 cores in each virtual machine. But again, we don't count the number of cores. So if we create 2 virtual machines and you want to install 2 licenses of SQL inside a virtual machine, we just count it just 1. So 1 for the physical and 2 for the virtual. So the total licenses of SQL is 3. And then client license, if you have 3 users, then you need to buy 3 licenses. Okay. So customers simply purchase 1 server license for each VM and a physical server running SQL software, and regardless of the number of cores. We don't count the number of cores, we don't count the number of processor. It's 1:1. Now, we'll talk about the core licensing now and how it works. So in this example, we have 1 physical server with 4 physical processor, and each physical processor has 6 cores. And if you're going to count the total number of cores, that's 24. Right? So that's 24 cores. And then we have something called hyper-threading. Hyper-threading is a feature in a processor that it will work twice faster. Okay? If hyper-threading is on, we need to multiply the number of cores. So if we count the total number of cores is 24. If hyper-threading is on, then you have 24. You have 48. The total number of cores is 48 if the hyper-threading is on. So now we will talk about the core licensing. Okay, this is where you install the license in a physical server, but it's per core. Per core model allows access to a limited number of users or device to connect to the SQL. You don't need to buy client access licenses. And per core license, okay, 1 per core license is equals to 2 cores. Again, 1 SQL license per core is equals to 2 cores. So if you have 1 processor with 4 cores, it means you need to buy 2 licenses in this example. So per core licensing, to get the correct number of licenses of SQL Server per core is first you need to determine what kind of processor. If it's an AMD series something, or if it's an Intel. Second, we need to count the total number of cores on each processor. Third, we need to get the core factor. Now, to get the core factor, we need to determine what kind of processor to get the core factor. Next, we multiply the core factor to the total number of cores, and then we divide it by 2. The reason why we divide it by 2 because 1 license of per core is equals to 2 cores. So that's the reason why we divide it by 2. Now, let's do an example. So again, this is installing the license in a physical server, doing physical core licensing. Okay. So first step, we need to know what kind of processor. Determine what kind of processor. It's the 2 Intel Xeon 6-core processor. So we know it's an Intel Xeon 6-core processor. Second step, we need to count the total number of cores. So each processor has 6 cores, so the total number of cores is 12. Third step is we need to get the core factor. Now to get the core factor, as you can see, there's a link. That's a link where to get the core factor table. So if there's probably a new core factor table, that's going to be the same link. Okay. So the core factor table, we need to know, remember, we need to determine what kind of processors, because the processor type, for example, if it's an AMD 31, 32, 41, 42, 61 to 62 series, the core factor is 0.75. If it's an Intel or AMD single core processors, we all know a single core processor is an old processor. The core factor is 4. If it's Intel AMD dual core processor, again, this is almost an old processor as well. So dual core processor, the core factor is 2. If it's none of the above, if it's not a dual core, if it's not a single core, if it's not an AMD 31 to 62 series, the core factor is 1. Okay? Again, if you want to get the link of the core factor table, the link is it's on the screen now. So first step, we determine, so it's an Intel Xeon 6 processor. Second step, we count the total number of cores, which is 12. Third step, the core factor. It's not an AMD 31 to 62 series. It's not a single core. It's not a dual core. Then the core factor is 1. So 12 times 1 is equal to 12. The last step is divided by 2. So we need to buy 6 licenses per core. This is only applicable for Enterprise Edition and Standard Edition per core. Okay? Let's do another example. This time we have 2 AMD 6200 6-core processors. So first step, determine it's a AMD 6200 processor. Second step, total number of cores is 12. Third step was the core factor. So it's an AMD 62 series, so the core factor is 0.75. Now, 12 times 0.75 is equals to 9. 9 divided by 2 is equals to 4.5. And we don't sell 4 licenses in a half. So we run it off to the highest number, so which is going to be 5 licenses. Okay? So in this example, customer would need to buy 5 licenses. Now, licensing per core is for the physical only. Okay, these are the steps on how to get the licenses if we're going to install the license in a physical server. Now, if we're going to install the license in a virtual machine using the per core model, you need to count the number of cores on each virtual machine, and then we divide it by 2. The core factors do not apply. It means you don't need to get the core factor and multiply it. It's just count the numbers of cores of each virtual machine and then divide it by 2. Okay? But the minimum number of cores on each virtual machine is 4. I repeat, when you create a virtual machine and if you want to install an SQL license per core in a virtual machine, the minimum number of cores is 4. So what if you create a virtual machine and you assign just 1 core? It's still going to be 4. If you create a virtual machine and you assign 2 cores, it's still going to be 4, because in the licensing for virtual core model, the minimum is 4. So if you're going to create a virtual machine, it's better to create 4 cores instead of having 1 or 2. Okay? So let's do an example. A customer created 3 virtual machine and wants to install SQL Server licenses inside a virtual machine. In virtual machine 1, customer assigned 2 cores. In virtual machine 2, they assigned 4 cores. And virtual machine 3, they assigned 6 cores. How many licenses total of Enterprise Edition? So remember the first step I've said earlier, you need to count the number of cores on each virtual machine, but as long as the minimum is 4, and then divided by 2, because 1 license per core is equals to 2 cores. So let's start with VM3. So count the total number of cores, it's 6, divided by 2, then 3 licenses. Virtual machine 2, 4 cores divided by 2, it's 2 licenses. VM1, it's 2 cores, but the minimum is 4. Remember? So even if you put 2, it's still going to be 4. If you put 1, it's still going to be 4. So if you have 2 cores, the minimum is 4. So 4 divided by 2 is 2. So the total number of licenses of Enterprise Edition is 7. So 2 licenses on VM1, 2 licenses on VM2, and 3 licenses on VM3. So if you total it, it's 7 licenses. And for Enterprise Edition, this is for SQL Server 2014 Enterprise Edition only, okay? You have a software assurance benefit. So if you have an Enterprise Edition with software assurance, and let's say you license all the physical cores on a physical server, and you want to install the licenses inside a virtual machine, you have an option to create a limited virtual machine and install Enterprise Edition inside a virtual machine, as long as, first, it's an Enterprise Edition, second, you have a software assurance, third, you need to have 4 cores in each virtual machine, and last one, the fourth one, you need to license each course on a physical server. So in this one, if you have one physical server with 2 processors and 4 cores each, the core license required is 8. Once you license 8, you have unlimited virtual machine with 4 cores each and an SQL Enterprise Edition licenses, unlimited. Now, if you want to do this, also consider the license for Windows Server, right? If you have a Windows Server and you want to create unlimited virtual machine, then I suggest you buy a Windows Server 2012 R2 data center if it's going to be unlimited virtual machine. Now, what if you have an Enterprise Edition but you don't have a software assurance? So without a software assurance, same thing again with 2 processor with 4 cores each. You need the core license required is 8. Now, instead of unlimited virtual machine, you can create 8 virtual machines, and as long as 4 cores each, and you have 8 licenses of Enterprise Edition inside a virtual machine. So let's do a quiz. In this example, the customer has one physical server with 4 processors, and each processor has 6 cores. And then they have 6 users. And then the customer created 4 virtual machines. In virtual machine 1, you have SQL Server Business Intelligence with 6 cores. Virtual machine 2, you have SQL Server Standard Core. It means it's licensed per core with 4 cores. Virtual machine 3, we have SQL Server Standard Core for 2 cores. And VM4, you have Enterprise Edition of 6 cores. So the question is, how many licenses of SQL Server on each virtual machine? And we need to be specific. So first one, virtual machine 1, you have 6 cores of Business Intelligence Edition. Remember, with the licensing of Business Intelligence Edition, it's per server in call. So it doesn't matter how many cores, since server in call is 1:1. So if it's one virtual machine with 6 cores, it's just going to be one license of Business Intelligence SQL Server 2014. For VM2, you have SQL Server Standard Core with 4 cores. It's just count the number of cores and then divided by 2. You need to have 2 licenses of Standard Core. VM3, 2 cores. again, but the minimum is 4 cores. So even if you put 2 cores, that's going to be 4 cores. So 4 divided by 2, 2 licenses of standard core. And then for VM4 Enterprise Edition with 6 cores, so 6 divided by 2, 3 licenses. So total is 1 business intelligence, 4 standard core licenses, and 3 enterprise core edition. Plus, you need to buy 6 client access licenses for the business intelligence. Okay. With this scenario also, if you want to get the number of Windows Server licenses, in this example, in case you might ask, in this example, the customers would need to buy 2 licenses of Windows Server Standard 2012 R2 licenses because of 4 processors and 4 virtual machines. Now with license mobility, we've just discussed this. The first part, we have the active passive. You need to have you need to have a software assurance, and you can reassign the license even more than 90 days as long as you have software assurance. And another benefit of software assurance is you can reassign the license on a different server as long as they have same specification. Remember, so as you can see, server 1 has 1 processor with 4 cores. When you reassign the license on the server 2, it should have the same processor, same specification, 1 processor with 4 cores. So that's a software assurance benefit of license mobility. It's even if it's more than 90 days, okay, irrespective of the 90 days rule. And with software assurance also, I can move the license, okay, or reassign the license, and it's allowed frequently to cloud. And you can move that in Microsoft Azure. So timelines and migration path. So if you want to do a downgrade with SQL Server 2014 standard, you can downgrade to a lower version, and it should be the same edition or lower. When I say downgrade to a lower edition, so 2014 is the current edition. If you downgrade to a lower edition, it should be the same edition. Lower edition, it could be a 2012. Okay, so 2014 downgrade to edition of 2012, and the same. SQL Server Standard Edition. Edition standard to standard, and to lower edition. Version is 2014 version to 2012 and earlier. That's a downgrade path. Sorry for the confusion. I'll just have to do it again. SQL Server 2014 standard, you can downgrade to the same edition, so standard to standard, or lower edition. So you can go down to server workgroup, server web, or server for small business. And you can downgrade to a lower version. It could be a 2012 or lower. For business intelligence, you can only downgrade to SQL Server 2012 business intelligence only, or you can downgrade to SQL Server Standard to 2012 or 2004 or earlier. So that's a downgrade. So 2014 business intelligence to 2012 business intelligence, that's a downgrade. Or 2014 business intelligence to standard edition, that's going to be a down edition. For SQL Server 2014, you can downgrade to the same edition or lower. So enterprise to data center business intelligence to standard, and lower version to 2012 to 2008 and earlier. Okay, that's the migration path. So the summary, again, for active passive, you need to have a software assurance. And then for BI for multiplexer, it needs to be a batch. Okay, so batch is defined as an active where tasks that occur at different times are processed at the same time. So for BI, you don't need calls are not required for data sources that batch process to business server. Okay. Now, if you want to get a copy of this presentation, that's the OneDrive link. It's a case sensitive. Make sure you type in the right key, the right characters. If it's a lower key or upper key, please follow the link. So I hope you've learned. I hope you've learned about the SQL Server 2014 licensing. And if you have any questions, you can send me an email. And thank you again for watching this video.